Part 2. Lessons from the Past. Chapter 4. Revolutionary Terror from Robespierre to Mao. What do you want? In his Logique des Mondes, Alain Badiou elaborates the eternal idea of the politics of revolutionary justice at work from the ancient Chinese legists through the Jacobins to Lenin and Mao. It consists of 4 moments: voluntarism, the belief that one can move mountains, ignoring objective laws and obstacles; terror, a ruthless will to crush the enemy of the people; egalitarian justice, its immediate brutal imposition, with no understanding for the complex circumstances which allegedly compel us to proceed gradually; and, last but not least, trust in the people. Suffice it to recall 2 examples here. Robespierre himself, his A Great Truth. The characteristic of popular government is to be trustful towards the people and severe towards the self. And Mao's critique of Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR, where he qualifies Stalin's point of view as almost altogether wrong. The basic error is mistrust of the peasants. In modern European history, the first to fully enact the politics of revolutionary justice were the Jacobins in the course of the French Revolution. When, in 1953, Zhou Enlai, the Chinese Prime Minister, was in Geneva for the peace negotiations to end the Korean War, a French journalist asked him what he thought about the French Revolution. Zhou replied, "It is still too early to tell." In a way, he was right. With the disintegration of the people's democracies in the late 1990s, the struggle for the historical significance of the French Revolution flared up again. The liberal revisionists tried to impose the notion that the demise of communism in 1989 occurred at exactly the right moment. It marked the end of the era which began in 1789, the final failure of the statist revolutionary model, which first entered the scene with the Jacobins. Nowhere is the dictum, "every history is a history of the present," more true than in the case of the French Revolution. Its historiographical reception has always closely mirrored the twists and turns of political struggles. The identifying mark of all kinds of conservatives is its flat rejection. The French Revolution was a catastrophe from the very beginning, the product of the godless modern mind. It is to be interpreted as God's punishment for humanity's wicked ways, so its traces should be effaced as thoroughly as possible. The typical liberal attitude is a differentiated one. Its formula is 1789 without 1793. In short, what the sensitive liberals want is a decaffeinated revolution, or a revolution which does not smell of a revolution. François Furet and others thus tried to deprive the French Revolution of its status as the founding event of modern democracy, relegating it to a historical anomaly. There was a historical necessity to assert the modern principles of personal freedom and so forth, but, as the English example demonstrates, the same could have been much more effectively achieved in a more peaceful way. Radicals are, on the contrary, possessed by what Alain Badiou calls the passion of the real. If you say A, equality, human rights, and freedom, you should not shirk from its consequences and gather the courage to say B, the terror needed to really defend and assert the A. And the same goes for the memory of May 1968. Days before the second round of the presidential elections in May 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy formulated the exorcism of the ghost of May 68 as the true choice facing the electorate. In this election, we should learn whether the inheritance of May 68 is to be perpetuated, or whether it should be liquidated once and for all. I want to turn the page of May 68. While one should defend the memory of 68, one should also bear in mind that the content of this memory is the stake of an ideological struggle, as Daniel Ben Said and Alain Krivine pointed out recently. There is their May and ours. The predominant liberal discourse appropriated the May 68 events as the beginning of the end of the traditional left, as the explosion of youthful energy and creativity, as France's belated entrance into hedonist modernity. For the left, on the contrary, May 68 was the unique moment of a general strike which paralyzed France and evoked the spectre of the disintegration of state power, the moment of unification, of the students' contestation with the workers' protests, part of the larger movement which encompassed student movements in the US, Germany, and Italy. However, it is all too easy to say that today's left should simply continue along this path. Some kind of historical rupture, effectively took place in 1990. Everyone, the contemporary radical left included, is somehow ashamed of the Jacobin legacy of revolutionary terror with its state-centralized character, so that the current doxa is that the left, if it is to regain political efficacy, should thoroughly reinvent itself, finally abandoning the so-called Jacobin paradigm. In our postmodern era of emergent properties, chaotic interaction of multiple subjectivities, of free interaction instead of centralized hierarchy, of a multitude of opinions instead of one truth, the Jacobin dictatorship is fundamentally not to our taste. The term taste should be given all its historical weight, as a word capturing a basic ideological disposition. Can one imagine anything more foreign to our universe of the freedom of opinions, of market competition, of nomadic pluralist interaction, and so on and so forth, than Robespierre's politics of truth, with a capital T, of course, whose proclaimed goal is to return the destiny of liberty into the hands of the truth. Such a truth can only be enforced in a terrorist manner. If the mainspring of popular government in peacetime is virtue, amid revolution it is at the same time virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is fatal. Terror, without which virtue is impotent. Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. It is less a special principle than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to our country's most pressing needs. This line of argumentation reaches its climax, paradoxical identification of its opposites. Revolutionary terror sublates the opposition between punishment and clemency. Just and severe punishment of the enemies is the highest form of clemency, so that rigor and charity coincide in terror. To punish the oppressors of humanity is clemency. To pardon them is barbarity. The rigor of tyrants has only rigor for a principle. The rigor of the Republican government comes from charity. Robespierre, Virtue and Terror. Do we still have ears for such a revolutionary coincidence of the opposites, of punishment and charity, of terror and freedom? The popular image of Robespierre is that of a kind of inverted elephant man. While the latter had a terribly deformed body, hiding a gentle and intelligent soul, Robespierre was a kind and polite person, hiding ice-cold, cruel determination, as signaled by his green eyes. As such, Robespierre serves perfectly today's anti-totalitarian liberals who no longer need to portray him as a cruel monster with a sneering evil smile, as was the case for 19th century reactionaries. Everyone is ready to recognize his moral integrity and full devotion to the revolutionary cause, since his very purity is the problem, the source of all trouble. As is indicated by the title of the latest biography of Robespierre, Ruth Sker's Fatal Purity. And, so that no one misses the point, Antonia Fraser, in her review, draws a chilling lesson for us today. Robespierre was personally honest and sincere, but the bloodlettings brought about by this sincere man surely warn us that belief in your own righteousness to the exclusion of all else can be as dangerous as the more cynical motivation of a deliberate tyrant. Happy are we who live under cynical public opinion manipulators, not under the sincere Muslim fundamentalists ready to fully engage themselves in their projects. What better proof of the ethico-political misery of our epoch, whose ultimate mobilizing motif is the mistrust of virtue? What then should those who remain faithful to the legacy of the radical left do with all this? Two things at the very least. First, the terrorist past has to be accepted as ours, even, or precisely because, it is critically rejected. The only alternative to the half-hearted defensive position of feeling guilty faced with our liberal or rightist critics is, we have to do the critical job better than our opponents. This, however, is not the entire story. One should also not allow our opponents to determine the terms and topic of the struggle. What this means is that ruthless self-criticism should go hand in hand with the fearless admission of what, to paraphrase Marx's judgment on Hegel's dialectics, one is tempted to call the rational kernel of the Jacobin terror. Materialist dialectics assumes, without particular joy, that, till now, no political subject was able to arrive at the eternity of the truth it was deploying without moments of terror. For, as Saint-Just asked, what do those who want neither virtue nor terror want? His answer is well known. They want corruption, another name for the subject's defeat. Badiou, logique des mondes. Or, as Saint-Just put it succinctly elsewhere, that which produces the general good is always terrible. These words should not be interpreted as a warning against the temptation to violently impose the general good on a society, but, on the contrary, as a bitter truth to be fully endorsed. The further critical point to bear in mind is that, for Robespierre, revolutionary terror is the very opposite of war. Robespierre was a pacifist, not out of hypocrisy or humanitarian sensitivity, but because he was well aware that war between nations, as a rule, serves as the means to obfuscate revolutionary struggle within each nation. Robespierre's speech on war is of special importance today. It shows him as a true peace lover who ruthlessly denounces the patriotic call to war, even if the war is formulated as the defense of the revolution. For it is the attempt of those who want revolution without revolution to divert the radicalization of the revolutionary process. His stance is thus the exact opposite of those who need war to militarize social life and take dictatorial control over it. Which is why Robespierre also denounced the temptation to export revolution to other countries, forcefully liberating them. The French are not afflicted with a mania for rendering any nation happy and free against its will. All the kings could have vegetated or died unpunished on their blood-spattered thrones if they had been able to respect the French people's independence. Jacobin revolutionary terror is sometimes half justified as the founding crime of the bourgeois universe of law and order, in which citizens are allowed to pursue their interests in peace. But one should reject this claim on two accounts. Not only is it factually wrong, many conservatives were quite right to point out that one can achieve bourgeois law and order without terrorist excesses, as was the case in Great Britain, although there is Cromwell to remember. Much more important, the revolutionary terror of 1792 to 94 was not a case of what Walter Benjamin and others call state-founding violence, but a case of divine violence. Interpreters of Benjamin wonder what divine violence could effectively mean. Is it yet another leftist dream of a pure event which never really takes place? One should recall here Friedrich Engels' reference to the Paris Commune as an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Of late, the social democratic Philistine has once more been filled with wholesome terror at the words, dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. One should repeat this, mutatis mutandis, apropos divine violence. Well and good, gentlemen, critical theorists. Do you want to know what this divine violence looks like? Look at the revolutionary terror of 1792 to 94. That was divine violence. And the series can continue, the Red Terror of 1919. That is to say, one should fearlessly identify divine violence with positively existing historical phenomena, thus avoiding all obscurantist mystification. When those outside the structured social field strike blindly, demanding and enacting immediate justice, vengeance, this is divine violence. Recall a decade or so ago the panic in Rio de Janeiro when crowds descended from the favelas into the wealthy part of the city and started looting and burning supermarkets. This was divine violence. Like biblical locusts, divine punishment for men's sinful ways, it strikes from out of nowhere, a means without an end, or as Robespierre put it in his speech, in which he demanded the execution of Louis XVI. Peoples do not judge in the same way as courts of law, They do not hand down sentences. They throw thunderbolts. They do not condemn kings. They drop them back into the void. And this justice is worth just as much as that of the courts. The dictatorship of the proletariat is thus another name for Benjaminian divine violence, which is outside the law, a violence exerted as brutal revenge justice. But why divine? Divine points towards the dimension of the inhuman. One should thus posit a double equation. Divine violence equals inhuman terror equals dictatorship of the proletariat. Benjaminian divine violence should be conceived as divine in the precise sense of the old Latin motto, vox populi, vox Dei, not in the perverse sense of we are doing it as mere instruments of the people's will, but as the heroic assumption of the solitude of a sovereign decision. It is a decision to kill, to risk or lose one's own life, made in absolute solitude, with no cover from the big other. If it is extra-moral, it is not immoral. It does not give the agent the license just to kill with some kind of angelic innocence. The motto of divine violence is fiat instantia, pereat mundus. It is through justice, the point of non-distinction between justice and vengeance, that the people, the anonymous part of no part, imposes its terror and makes other parts pay the price. Judgment Day for the long history of oppression, exploitation, suffering, or, as Robespierre himself put it in a poignant manner, what do you want, you who would like truth to be powerless on the lips of representatives of the French people? Truth undoubtedly has its power. It has its anger, its own despotism. It has touching accents and terrible ones that resound with force in pure hearts as in guilty consciences. And that untruth can no more imitate than Salome can imitate the thunderbolts of heaven, but accuse nature of it, accuse the people which wants it and loves it. And this is what Robespierre is targeting in his famous accusation to the moderates, that what they really want is a revolution without a revolution. They want a revolution deprived of the excess in which democracy and terror coincide. A revolution respecting social rules, subordinated to pre-existing norms. A revolution in which violence is deprived of the divine dimension and thus reduced to a strategic intervention serving precise and limited goals. Citizens, did you want a revolution without a revolution? What is this spirit of persecution that has come to revise, so to speak, the one that broke our chains? But what sure judgment can one make of the effects that can follow these great commotions? Who can mark, after the event, the exact point at which the waves of popular insurrection should break? At that price, what people could ever have shaken off the yoke of despotism? For while it is true that a great nation cannot rise in a simultaneous movement, and that tyranny can only be hit by the portion of citizens that is closest to it, how would these ever dare to attack it if, after the victory, delegates from remote parts could hold them responsible for the duration of violence, of the political torment that had saved the homeland? They ought to be regarded as justified by tacit proxy for the whole of society. The French, Friends of Liberty, meeting in Paris last August, acted in that role, in the name of all the départements. They should either be approved or repudiated entirely. To make them criminally responsible for a few apparent or real disorders, inseparable from so great a shock, would be to punish them for their devotion. This authentic revolutionary logic can be discerned already at the level of rhetorical figures, where Robespierre likes to turn around the standard procedure of first evoking an apparently realistic position and then displaying its illusory nature. He often starts with presenting a position or description of a situation as an absurd exaggeration, a fiction, and then goes on to remind us that what, in a first approach, cannot but appear as a fiction is actually truth itself. But what am I saying? What I have just presented as an absurd hypothesis is actually a very certain reality. It is this radical revolutionary stance, which also enables Robespierre to denounce the humanitarian concern with victims of revolutionary divine violence. A sensibility that wails almost exclusively over the enemies of liberty seems suspect to me. Stop shaking the tyrant's bloody robe in my face, or I will believe that you wish to put Rome in chains.